Hello and welcome, I'm Tafragdamu. Though slow, the repatriation of Ethiopian treasures has continued. The latest happened to be the locks of Alemayehu Tedros' hair, cups and so on looted from Meqdela by the British Army back in 1868. What does that tell us? Do we need to do a bit more? My guest today, Dr. Alula Pankhurst, is one of the people involved in the Restitution project. A very warm welcome to the program, Dr. Alula.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
What is the backstory here? Can you give us a bit of a background about how these pieces were collected?
Sure. So we had a wonderful ceremony at the National Museum on the 6th of January, Ethiopian Christmas Eve, when Ambassador Tafari brought these items looted items from the Meqdela British 1868 campaign, and he brought them back to Ethiopia on Christmas Eve as a kind of a Christmas present. So this was wonderful news. And the story behind that is that there was a ceremony held on the 21st of September in London at the Athenaeum Club, organized by the Scheherazade Foundation, for the handover of these various artifacts to be restituted and repatriated to Ethiopia. And there were three main types of artifacts. And so there was a very beautiful cup that had on silver plated and embossed, taken from Meqdela. So it was very clear that this was a looted item. And a British gentleman who, when his father died, looked at his father's collections, found this cup, beautiful horn cup, and he heard that there had been initiatives to restore artifacts, and he got in touch with the Scheherazade Foundation and the Ethiopian Embassy and other people, and there was a discussion. He was quite concerned whether, if this cup was returned to Ethiopia, it would be kept safely in museums. And he asked what has happened to previous artifacts. And so I was able to reassure him that even the manuscript of the Kebra Nagast that Emperor Johannes asked Queen Victoria to be returned, and was returned by the trustees of the British Museum. The British Museum trustees, in those days being very enlightened, agreed to return this manuscript.
And it's now
still in the Raguel Church, and we can talk about that in a while. But coming back to our story, so John Lee very kindly donated this cup, and the Scheherazade Foundation also sourced some other items, another cup that has Meqdela written on it, burnt into the horn cup, and several other items, including a very beautiful shield. Another initiative was a descendant of Captain Speedy living in New Zealand.
Captain Speedy is the guy who...
So what happened was after the British expedition in 1868, and the British expedition came to free the prisoners that Emperor had taken when he wanted an alliance with Queen Victoria and didn't receive any response. And so the British forces came with troops from India, including elephants, and Emperor Tewodros had a last stand at the fortress of Meqdela and tried to negotiate, sent cattle. It was Easter as a peace negotiation. But by then, Lord Napier, the head of the expedition, didn't want to negotiate. And so Tewodros freed the prisoners. And rather than the condition for his surrender would have been for him to give himself up, which he refused to do. And he shot himself, allegedly with the pistol that Queen Victoria had earlier given to him, which had written on it, given to Emperor Tewodros, in gratitude for your kindness to our consul Plowden, because there was a very close relationship between Britain and Ethiopia prior to the Meqdela incident. And so at that point, the Prince Alemayehu was with his mother, and the Queen and the Prince went with the British forces down towards the coast. And very sadly, the Emperor Alemayehu's mother died from consumption, which sadly he himself, 18 years, when he was 18, 10 years later in Leeds, he died similarly from consumption. And Captain Speedy had come to Ethiopia previously and had learned Amharic and knew Theodros, and so he was given charge to become the person who looked after Alemayehu, and actually took him to Queen Victoria. And there was a tussle between Queen Victoria and her government about what should happen to the prince. She felt he should stay in the family, and Captain Speedy had married and, in fact, was sent to India. And Alemayehu went with him to India and Malaya, but the government's position, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was that he should go to a public school in a boarding.
We don't want to spend money on this kid, you know.
Well, I mean, they were putting him in a public school and then also the Sandhurst Military Academy, neither of which were very conducive to Alemayehu's temperament. And very sadly, he died. And this has been very much written about in this seminal book by Andrew Heavens, The Prince and the Plunder. And also the story is being studied by Ian Campbell, who's also working on a book. So coming back to the hair, Prince Alemayehu, as you know, Emperor Theodros's hair was also returned to Ethiopia in 2018. And that story is a very different story, because when the British forces came up on the Meqdela Amba, on the stronghold, and they found Emperor Theodros, they began to take bits of his dress, his bloodied hands.
As a souvenir.
As souvenirs, and also his hair. And that was in the Imperial War Museum. And then when Professor Hirut, the Minister of Culture, visited, she said, you shouldn't be keeping human remains. The museum thought about it and then decided this was correct. They took it off the website, and then they returned it to the next Minister of Culture, Dr. Hirut, and she brought it back.
And why is this any different?
So it's very different, because that was taking mementos as kind of trophies of victory. That was the spirit of cutting locks of hair from the emperor. Whereas, in a sense, the hair that was cut of Alemayehu at age 9 was a sign of love, of friendship, and was something that was a memento. I mean, Queen Victoria herself had a locket with Prince Albert, her husband's hair that she used to carry. And the Victorians had very much a tradition of keeping hair. And so there was the descendants of Captain Speedy who moved to New Zealand. They found an envelope. They only found an envelope which had the hair of Prince Alemayehu, age 9, written on it, and the hair of Captain Speedy. So
these are things that Captain Speedy has left behind.
That's right. And it's really quite extraordinary that the hair of Captain Speedy and Alemayehu both found their way they met together in Ethiopia. They came together to Britain. They went together to India and Malaya. And the hair was found together in New Zealand. And so when the family found this, they said, well, this should come back. And they contacted poet Lemon Sisai, and he contacted the Ethiopian embassy.
And he organized that event in London and so on. So these are basically donated, like all these treasures?
Yes, and in this particular case, what is very special is that the family of Captain Speedy, initially, the idea was that Alemayehu's hair would return to Ethiopia, but then on consideration, the idea that since they were together from Ethiopia to England, to India, to Malaya, and back to England, why not the hair of Captain Speedy also comes to Ethiopia? So Ambassador Teferi also brought the 2 locks of hair in a box with a picture, a postcard of Alemayehu, and the family also donated other items.
And the family of Captain Speedy, they had no qualms about all this?
Quite the
when
contrary.
they laid this treasure. Probably that is one of the things that's very near and dear to them after their ancestor has passed away.
Yes, but I mean, I think they felt that Alemayehu's heir should return to his country. He himself wanted to return to his country. The palace, Windsor Palace, has made a statement that it would be too difficult to return his remains because it would disturb other remains in a crypt that has other people's remains in it.
But that of Captain Speedy's?
So Captain Speedy died in UK, and he was actually cremated.
I mean, how easily did they let it go?
The hair?
The hair, yes.
Well, no, it was a spontaneous decision at the Athenaeum Club when Leonie was asked, well, what are you going to do with Captain Speedy's hair? And the suggestion, well, they were together. Why doesn't the hair come to Ethiopia too? The family was happy with that.
So these are all the treasures that have returned to Ethiopia. When was it? Last week, right?
Yes, and there was also.
Do we have any other?
Also a third very important restitution that happened, which was a holy Tabot, Ark of the Covenant. And in this case, the credit goes to an Italian art historian, Dr. Jacopo Nisci, who is a very eminent art historian who has studied Ethiopian and Eritrean art, and he has worked in the British Museum and is a lecturer at University College London.
But this Tabot is not from the British Museum. It was in the hands of individual private collectors, right?
Indeed. And the private collector wanted to sell this Tabot, and once Jacopo ascertained that it was a Tabot, he didn't actually look at it, obviously being a Tabot, but there was a picture of it, a drawing of it. And so when he realized it was a Tabot, he said, this should be returned. And the owners did not want to return it, and so Jacopo actually purchased it to restitute it. And then in discussions with the Orthodox, the Patriarchate in Addis, and a committee was formed to verify, to ascertain that it was indeed a Tabot. And priests in London, particularly Dr. Gessi Sabata, he went and authenticated the Tabot. And so being a Tabot, obviously it was not brought to the ceremony at the Scheherazade Foundation, but went taken to the Church of St. Mary in London. And the Sunday after the ceremony, there was a very impressive church ceremony, and the Tabot was reconsecrated for returning to Ethiopia.
Did we know that the Tabot existed in the hands of private collectors before, or is that just...
So the Meqdela expedition took a lot of Tabots. There was one that ended up in a church in Edinburgh, and a priest there discovered it over 20 years ago, and it was returned with great ceremony and pomp to Ethiopia, with large crowds of people going to Bole Airport to receive it. And a second Tabot was up for auction, and a medical doctor who an Irishman who converted to Orthodox Christianity, bought it and brought it back to Ethiopia. And then Westminster Abbey retains another Tabot that was also one that was donated by Captain Arbuthnot. And here you have a context where a sister church is holding hostage a relic, and this comes directly under the crown. And so there are negotiations for this Tabot to be returned. Most importantly, the British Museum has 11 Tabots, 10 of which are clearly looted from Meqdela. And the British Museum Act clearly states that if items cannot be displayed to the public or studied by researchers, they can be deaccessioned. So there's actually no reason for these Tabots to be remained. And here we have
And they are not living up to that. Yeah.
An individual taking the initiative. And actually, the Scheherazade Foundation gave him a medal in recognition for his gracious act.
It's interesting, as your father used to say, Tabots don't make the British Museum any holier.
Indeed.
But we're talking about here, I mean, considering the amount of the loot that we have seen, or heard, or are documented, this is just a fragment, just a piecemeal.
Indeed. The British forces had elephants and 200 mules, and they carried all this loot. There was an auction, and what happened was when the soldiers came onto the citadel, they started burning and looting. The officers stopped them. They gathered all the things, and they held an auction. And the British Museum representative, Richard Holmes, had £1,000 to spend. So he bought the best items and was also given some of the prize items like the crowns and holy chalices and the most beautiful manuscripts. So over 300 manuscripts that were purchased for the British Library and others in private collections. So the amount of loot is enormous. In fact, Andrew Heavens, in his book, The Prince and the Plunder, has an inventory of, they are in over 27 museums in the UK and in 9 other countries. And he has a website with that. So it's a tremendous amount. And there are some very beautiful items, manuscripts. There is the revolver that Queen Victoria gave to Theodros, which is now in the royal collection, the one that has given as a gift in gratitude for your service to your kindness to our consul. So that, yes, there are a lot. It's only a fragment of the items, and maybe 25 or so items have been returned so far. And what is very interesting is that whenever there is any talk about restitution and repatriation, the immediate objection is, well, what has happened to items that have been returned? Are they...
Exactly, they could be looted again.
Exactly.
All the fear that they have. What do you say to that?
Well, one item was looted again. So when Emperor Haile Selassie went to England and he met King George decided to give him a gift, and they gave him, there were 2 crowns in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they gave 1 crown as a gesture of friendship. And Emperor Haile Selassie mentions it in his autobiography. He said he was not happy that this had ended up in the UK, but he was very grateful that it was being given back, and it was handed to Empress Zodi by the British ambassador here. And then when the Italians came, that seems to have disappeared, and we don't know what happened. Italians also looted a lot of other objects, and 4 or 5 crowns ended up in the Colonial Museum. And then Mussolini, when he fled, he took these crowns with him. And there's a picture that the partisans took that's in Ian Campbell's book of these crowns of the partisans who were killed when they killed Mussolini. So it seems that crown disappeared. But when we look at the history of restitution, the first item that came back was in 1872, and the trustees of the British Museum returned a manuscript to Ethiopia. So Emperor Johannes wrote to the Queen Victoria and asked for only 2 items back. So one was the icon of Christ with the crown of thorns that the emperors used to take into battle. And he asked for this, and Queen Victoria wrote back saying, sorry, we couldn't find it. Maybe it didn't come to England. And actually, it had been kept by Richard Holmes, the British Museum representative, was later sold by his widow and sold again and bought by an art collector in Portugal, and is now in a bank vault in Portugal, where the Portuguese government has said it shouldn't leave the country, has made an edict on that. So there are negotiations, and that would be really something that the Ethiopian government should press for the return of that artifact, which in fact is not even Portuguese, it's Flemish. The other item was the Cobra Negus, the Glory of the Kings, And that was returned by the British government. So Lord Granville, the foreign minister, asked the British Museum. The trustees got together and agreed to the requests. They looked and they found two such manuscripts of the Kubra Nagast. There was one very large one that had the manuscript, the story of the Kubra Nagast, and a lot of other things. They kept that one, and they decided to return the smaller one, which also had, at the end, stories relating to Aksum, about the church there and gifts, and probably Emperor Johannes might well have wanted it because of the fact it has a map of Aksum, a diagrammatic map, and various other data and information about Aksum. And so it was returned. It was brought back by Kirkham, who was an adventurer who helped Emperor Johannes in his train his army. And then it was disappeared for a while, or at least the next trace we have is a French traveler, Leroux, who comes to Emperor Menelik, and he hears from a colleague, Haile Mariam, who was from Tigray, who tells him that this Kubra Nagast was kept after the death. Emperor Johannes died through a stray bullet at the Battle of Matamma, and apparently his father confessor took this manuscript and gave it to the monasteries, and it ended up at Debre Libanos Monastery. And then when Leroux heard about it, he asked Emperor Menelik, and Emperor Menelik said, yes, of course, this should be translated. A people do not ensure that their history continues only through guns, but also through their writings and their manuscripts. So the clergy were requested to bring this manuscript, and Leroux made a translation, and he was astonished to see the writing returned to Ethiopia by the trustees of the British Museum at the request of Emperor John, 1872. And he was just astonished that this manuscript had survived. Well, not only did it survive until Emperor Menelik's time, it then was it was documented as being in the church of Raguel on Ntoto, and then it was brought to the church of Raguel that Empress Menen, when in exile, she made a vow that if she managed to return to her country, she would build a church of Raguel in the Mercato. And
still there?
It is still there.
150 years, nearly 150 years.
So this is evidence that, items that are returned are kept, and all the items that were returned through the Afronet, the initiatives of the Association for the Return of the Meqdela Ethiopian Treasures in the 2000s, so some 20 items, there are amulets and paintings and shields and swords, various items. They are all in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies museum, some of them in display. Other items will be displayed in the Jubilee Palace is now being about to be opened to the public. And so Queen Elizabeth, as a gesture of friendship in 1965, brought back the seal of Emperor Theodros and the Abun's crownlets. And so, that is still there. So there are items in the Jubilee Museum, in the National Museum, in the ethnographic collection of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies Museum, and in churches such as Raguel. So this idea that items coming back will then necessarily disappear is probably not true. And the British Museum itself has recently been subject to a lot of thefts by an insider, so we can't be sure that the things will be kept there either.
Interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Alula. It was really a pleasure having you on my show.
Thank you very much.